Alright, so today I'm going to be presenting about the Mundell-Fleming model and the ISLM curve. So these are both sort of macroeconomic models that the government can use to see the effects of fiscal and monetary policy on the economy. So the ISLM curve is quite old, it's like 1937 I think. John Hick made it, he was working off the work of John Maynard Keynes. And yeah, these are pretty essential to macroeconomic modelling. Like a lot of other models are based off of these, so it's pretty important to know, but it's not on our A-level course I think. So first a few definitions, most of you should already know these, but GDP is the total output of an economy over time. Saving is the proportion of income not spent. Investment is spending on capital equipment by firms. Income is all payments received by residents in an economy in exchange for providing capital production. National income is the same but with earning from assets overseas. And capital mobility, this is really important, is the ease at which financial capital can be moved across countries due to interest rates. And we also need to make a few assumptions for our model. We firstly assume it's a closed economy. As Mr. Dawes says, we're only working within these four walls. There's no international trade, there's no exports, no imports. We assume that the only injections into the circular flow of income, so that's the way that income flows between consumers, they buy goods, producers pay them income, and it cycles around. So the only injections and withdrawals are savings and investment. So we're going to ignore imports, exports, government spending and taxation for right now. We're also assuming a fixed money supply, so we're assuming that the central bank has a fixed money supply, that they change interest rates to meet their criteria rather than changing the money supply every time. And we assume that these curves are linear. As with a lot of economics, the curves are obviously going to be curved all the time, but we're going to assume they're linear for now, so it's easy to see. So investment saving, the ISLM model is made of the IS curve and the LM curve. IS means investment saving, and that's every single combination of interest rate and GDP where macroeconomic equilibrium can be achieved. Right, so that's every single level where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, and we can prove that using a bit of intuition. So GDP, as we know, is equal to aggregate demand and national income, and that's only at macroeconomic equilibrium. So then AD equals AS, aggregate spending is equal to national income. And so the two equations that we have are AD is equal to consumption plus investment, national income is equal to consumption plus savings. So when you have income, you can either spend it on goods and services or you can save it, and those are the two things there. When we set them equal to each other, consumption's on both sides, it cancels out. So you get investment is always equal to saving when the economy is in equilibrium, at least in the goods market. So this is the function for it that they use in economics, but we're going to ignore these two for right now. So this is what the IS curve looks like. So you have interest rates on the y-axis and GDP slash AD slash national income on the x-axis. As you can see, it's downward sloping, so you can again use intuition to explain this. I think you can also use differential equations, but it's just easier to understand this way. So at high interest rates, you have high interest rates. That means that the cost of borrowing is really high, so firms are going to be less incentivized to invest. They'll produce less, resulting in a lower GDP. At lower interest rates, the cost of borrowing is relatively low, so firms are more likely to invest, they're more likely to produce more, and so GDP is higher. That's why it's downward sloping. So moving on to LM, which is the other part of the ISLM model. This one deals with the money market rather than the goods market. LM actually stands for liquidity preference is equal to money supply. Essentially what that means is money demand is equal to money supply. So it's a combination of interest rates and real GDP, but the supply of money in the economy by the central bank is equal to the preference for liquidity, which is cash basically in that economy. And yeah, when the money market is it's in equilibrium, there's enough money in circulation to fulfill all spending needs. So everyone that wants cash has it. This is the LM curve. As you can see, it's different from the other one. It's upward sloping. This is because, if you imagine this to be national income for now, because at equilibrium they're both the same. Low levels of national income, consumers have less income, there's less output being produced, there's less demand for cash because there's just less things to buy. And so interest rate, which is basically the cost of borrowing and the cost of cash, you could say, that's low as well because there's such low demand for money. When there's high national income, that means there's loads of economic activity going on, there's a lot of output being produced, there's a lot of income that consumers have, and so they're more likely to want to borrow money. That's why the interest rates are higher, to ration that money off, kind of. So now in our ISLM model, we put these two things together. So we draw them both on the same axes. There's the money market, this is the goods market, and the point where these two curves meet is where both the money market and the goods market are in equilibrium. That doesn't mean the entire economy is. Obviously, we've excluded the international aspect and we've also left out labour markets, but This is the interest rate at which equilibrium can be achieved. This is the GDP. That's where the two curves meet. Yeah, it's pretty useful. It's pretty simple as well until we add the extra bits for the Mundell-Fleming model, but we can do some core analysis with this as well. So you can see the effect of fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is changing government spending or taxation. Expansionary fiscal policy is when the government spends more or taxes less. That means that since government spending is a component of aggregate demand and therefore GDP, when they increase their spending, they're increasing aggregate demand in the economy. They also increase GDP. So at every single interest rate, there's a greater level of GDP, so the entire IS curve shifts right. And you can see that the interest rate increases and the GDP also increases. Whereas with contractionary fiscal policy, that means the government's reducing their spending or they're taxing more. So there's less aggregate demand and therefore less GDP at every single interest rate. So the entire IS curve shifts to the left. There's a reduction in interest rates and there's a fall in GDP. So the government spending fiscal policy only affects the IS curve, whereas monetary policy affects the LM curve. So what we're assuming is that in order to enact monetary policy, the bank can only change their money supply because the interest rates can already change. So if there's an increase in the money supply, that means there's more money in the economy that will filter through the circular flow of income. So if producers have more, they'll pass on more in wages, and then they'll buy more goods and services, etc. So there's more money in the economy, and that means that there's more output, there's more income. That means that the LM curve will shift to the right because there's greater income at every single interest rate. There's a fall in interest rates from this level to this level. There's an increase in real GDP from here to here. It's the opposite of contractionary monetary policy, so that's when the central bank reduces the supply of money. The LM curve shifts left instead. There's an increase in interest rates and a decrease in real GDP. There are two special cases, however. The old model isn't exactly what happens. Sometimes when the interest rates are really low, let's just say like it's 0.25%, the interest rates are so low that demand for money becomes basically just, it doesn't change at all when interest rates change. If it changes from 0.25 to 0.26, it's so small that consumers aren't going to change their behavior based on such small changes. So the LM curve is just flat, so equilibrium can be achieved at any GDP at the same interest rate. It's also the same, this LM curve is also flat for a variable money supply. That's when the central bank, rather than changing interest rates, they decide to change the money supply. This is more common now because, like you might know, the central bank just has a desired interest rate, let's just say 4%. They'll keep the interest rate at 4% and then they'll influence the money supply to make sure that it stays here so that it can, equilibrium can be achieved at whatever GDP, but it can be achieved at this interest rate. As you can see here, if fiscal policy is now used in this example, if the IS curve shifts to the right, you have an increase in GDP. Let me just draw it. If it shifts to the right, you'd have an increase in GDP from here to here. Right, but there'd be no resulting increase in interest rates, so there'd be no increase in cost of borrowing. So that makes fiscal policy really effective because it avoids the overcrowding effect, which is on this diagram here. So this is when the LM curve becomes really steep. So a small change in real GDP causes a massive increase in real interest rates. As you can see here, when governments, for example, increase their spending, they use fiscal policy, the IS curve shifts to the right. That means that while there's a small increase in real GDP, which is the desired outcome, there's a much larger increase in real interest rates. And obviously interest rates are the cost of borrowing. If there's really high interest rates, firms will borrow less, they'll produce less, and as a result, there'll be less production in the economy. So despite the initial increase, the IS curve actually might come down to where it was because of the fall in investment. So yeah, overcrowding makes fiscal policy a bit more ineffective. That's the ISLM model done. Now moving on to the Mundell-Fleming model, which is basically the same thing, but it incorporates the international economy. So it's a lot more representative of an actual economy because obviously I don't think any economy is completely closed in this day and age. Yeah, it deals with open economies, it's more realistic. It's made by Robert Mundell and Marcus Fleming. Their papers are available online on JSTOR, I think. I had a read of them and it's actually quite interesting. It's only a few pages, but it's not as sort of deep as you might think it is. So the BOP, we add another curve into the mix now, as well as the LM curve and the IS curve. We have the BP curve. The BOP deals with the international economy, it's the balance of payments. There's the GCSE definition. But this is basically the varying interest rates and levels of GDP where imports and foreign investment out of the economy, which are outflows, is equal to the exports and foreign investment into an economy, which is inflows. So all the money flowing out of your economy into other economies is equal to the amount of money flowing into your economy from other economies. That's what we're saying. And that means that the current account balance and the financial account balance, so the two aspects of the BOP, will be equal to 0. This deals with trade and income flows. The financial account deals with assets. Yeah, capital mobility, as we'll see in a moment, is also really important. There's actually two versions of the VP curve. There's one with imperfect capital mobility, so if you remember, that's where capital changes value as you move it between different economies. And this one is perfect capital mobility, where it doesn't change at all, so your assets will be worth the same no matter which economy you keep them in. If you have one with imperfect capital mobility, which is obviously the real life scenario, that's what happens most of the time. It's very difficult to achieve like these theoretical concepts, but in this case, the BP curve is upward sloping, but this is because at low levels of national income, right, consumers don't have much income, so they're not going to spend as much, they spend less on imports, most crucially, and that means that because there's little spending on imports, to balance out the balance of payments, you need very little investment, so the interest rates can be low because you don't need to attract investment in from foreign investors. Whereas at high levels of national income, your consumers in your economy are going to spend a lot more on imports, so there'll be more money flowing out of your economy. In order to balance that, you need money flowing in, which you achieve by increasing interest rates, which encourages foreign investment into your country because then assets will earn more interest for the holders and it will help your economy grow. Yeah, this is also sometimes called the FX curve because it deals with the foreign exchange market, so you might say like that sometimes. Now we combine all three of them into the Mundell-Fleming model. So this is the version with imperfect capital mobility. It's a little bit difficult to understand, so I'll just use this one. This is the one with perfect capital mobility, so your capital is the same in any different economy. So we call this the world interest rate, so this R star. That means that essentially every single economy in the world has such a similar interest rate that there's no point moving assets, so we just represent the BP curve as completely flat, because equilibrium in the international market can be achieved at this interest rate with any level of GDP. So now we look at shifts again. If we look at fiscal policy and monetary policy, this time it's a little bit different because you have to factor in the BOP, and it really depends on exchange rates. That's the most important thing for these shifts. So at fixed exchange rates, right, exchange rates are the value of one currency in terms of another currency, and fixed exchange rates means that two economies agree that their two currencies will be exactly the same value for a given period of time. Let's just say the US and the UK decide that $1.50 is going to be equal to £1 for I don't know how long, but they decide that. That means that the central bank has to keep the exchange rate at the same. So that means that fiscal policy becomes really effective, as we'll see in a second, and monetary policy becomes really ineffective. So this is why. Imagine fiscal policy, right? If the government starts to spend more and they increase aggregate demand, so every single interest rate, the IS curve shifts that way. That means that now there's a higher rate of interest and a higher level of GDP, right? It's gone like this. And the economy is in disequilibrium. These curves don't all match up. So what that means is higher interest rates are going to attract even more foreign investment. So there'll be more demand for the pound because to buy your assets, they have to have your currency. So that increase in the demand for the pound will cause the central bank to have more foreign reserves because people will pay them in foreign currency to give the domestic currency. That means that the bank can, in order to keep the exchange rate the same, they can increase their money supply. So in order to keep the fixed interest rates, the bank has to increase the money supply, and that leads to not only the increase in GDP, but there's also no change in interest rates, so the interest rates stay the same, and you get a massive increase in GDP. That makes my fiscal policy really effective because you have an increase in GDP while you avoid increases in interest rates, so there's no overcrowding effect. Investment doesn't get reduced by this. Now, if you look at the other one, this is monetary policy. Let's just say the central bank decides to increase the money supply in the economy, right? And we get LM dash, so the curve shifts here. What that means is the interest rate now becomes lower, and because it's lower, foreign investors will start putting their assets out of your economy. They'll demand less of your currency, and so the central bank will have a lower supply of foreign reserves. And in order to keep the exchange rate the same, they now have to move the LM curve back to where it was before. So there's no overall change. So monetary policy is really ineffective because it can't influence the interest rate in the economy anymore. However, it's the opposite of floating exchange rates. So floating exchange rates is where the value of one currency in terms of another can be allowed to change depending on supply and demand for the currency. So in this case, the roles are reversed. Fiscal policy becomes completely ineffective, and monetary policy becomes really effective because currencies can appreciate or depreciate. If we examine fiscal policy again, so there's a shift to the left of IS. Let's say there's a fall in taxation, more consumption, GDP increases at every single interest rate. that means that the interest rate has gone from here to here, right? And that means that foreign investors will be more likely to invest in your economy. They'll demand more of the pound again. But this time, because of that increased demand for the pound will appreciate. So your currency will be worth more in relative to other currencies. Your consumers can buy more imports, and foreigners will find it harder to buy exports. So that means that net exports will actually decrease. So as you know, net exports is also compared to aggregate demand. So this initial increase is cancelled out because it just goes back to where it was before, because net exports falls. So there's no overall shift because of fiscal policy. It's completely ineffective now. If we look at monetary policy, however, it's completely different. If we assume that the central bank increases the money supply again, the LM curve shifts to the right. Then there's a fall in the interest rate. Again, investors will put out their money out of your economy, they'll invest somewhere else. And this fall in interest rates means there will be less demand for your currency. The currency depreciates because of lower demand, the price of the currency decreases, right? And that means that your consumers in this economy are less able to buy imports, and so foreigners in other economies are more able to buy exports. So that means net exports increases, real GDP increases at every level, so the IS curve shifts to the right as well. Again, same interest rate, much higher GDP, which is really beneficial for the economy because there's no overcrowding effect and there's an increase in GDP. So if you use the Mundell-Fleming model, it's really useful as a macroeconomic tool because it basically simplifies the economy down into really simple terms. It also uses the basis for more advanced models. So the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that we're learning now in GCSE economics is based off this. And it also incorporates the international economy and interest exchange rates, which the ISLM model didn't. So it's obviously a lot more realistic because it incorporates more aspects of the economy, and it's a lot better than the ISLM model because the international economy is actually a big part of most modern economies. And it does this, which is really important. It can prove that the economy can't maintain a fixed exchange rate, free capital movement, and independent monetary policy, and you can prove that graphically. There are a few limitations, however. First one is only valid in the short run, so as you'll have noticed that it doesn't account for inflation at all, it doesn't account for unemployment. This is not like intentional, it's because at that time when it was made in the 1900s, there was actually not that much inflation when they made this. They were more worried about growth than preventing inflation. That's why it's more focused on interest rates and growth rather than on inflation and unemployment. Also, yeah, it's really theoretical. Obviously, capital mobility isn't always fixed, so rather than being like this, the VP curve would usually be upward sloping, so it'd be a lot harder to predict what would happen, and the curve shifts become a lot more complex. It also ignores real-world fluctuations, so it doesn't take into account recessions or fluctuations in demand and supply. And also, yeah, as I said before, it doesn't take unemployment and inflation into account, so it's a little bit outdated. Questions?
So most of the governments, right, if you look at a normal AD and AS curve,
Yeah.
you have price level, which is important because the government needs to think about a low and stable rate of inflation.
Yeah.
And on the horizontal axis, you have GDP, which is important for economic growth, right? So most of the time, they're going to use an AD/AS curve. How often would they ever use an ISLM curve? Because I get that it can be useful, but like, do we ever really use it?
We don't use it as of right now because at the moment, as I said, inflation is a much bigger problem right now, so that's why we tend to use the AD/AS curve a bit more. Obviously, in governments, they don't actually use like exactly these kind of models. The way they do it is they list pretty much every single variable that can influence the economy. They have functions for those variables, and they compute like if they change the government spending, what will happen to every single other variable. That's how they work it. But those models are actually based off like the AD/AS model. This one is more used in the 1900s, like in the 1940s, 50s. This one would have been used a lot more because they were all more worried about how can we stimulate growth. Like they were more worried about interest rates. Inflation wasn't really a problem for them at all, so they didn't have to worry about the price levels. I think they did adjust for price levels in the short run, but they didn't do it in the long run. Any other questions? Yeah, Will?
Have there been any kind of work or innovation on the Mundell-Fleming model since it's been developed? I know you said it's quite updated, or has it kind of stayed static and they've moved on to more?
I mean, yeah, the model itself has stayed relatively static, but it has inspired more works coming out. As I said, the AD/AS model is based a little bit off that, and it was called the Keynesian cross. It's based off the work of John Maynard Keynes, and he did his work in the 1930s, 40s. So the information we get from these models is used in a lot of other models nowadays.
Like, what made you look into this topic? How did you come across it?
I mean, over the holidays, I was interested in I'm quite interested in fiscal policy. I was interested in how governments can sort of predict what happens and central banks can predict what happens when they make a decision because there will be so many variables involved. And this is one of the simpler ways of just viewing the economy in its most basic terms and seeing how those things on their own influence the economy, and that's the basis of how governments and banks can make their decisions. Obviously, it's not the whole picture. The whole picture is a lot more complicated, but this is an easy way to understand, I guess, to get an introduction into that process. Yeah, very.
So you mentioned that overcrowding occurs when the LM curve is very steep. Are there any factors affecting the gradients of the curves?
Yeah, so I mean, that just depends on how responsive the economy is to changes in GDP. So if inflation is really high, for example, then the central bank's, if GDP increases, the central bank's going to raise interest rates a lot faster. So it can be things like that. So I guess you can say that it does account for some fluctuation, but there's a lot rarer because the axes themselves, you have just so the interest rates and the GDP levels used are not real, they're nominal, so it doesn't really account for inflation, but I guess that's one of the ways which you could potentially use it. Any others? Right, thanks.